Fort Bragg Dining Facility, 1842 hours. 11 Rangers were about to make the worst mistake of their military careers. The space hummed with the peculiar energy of tribal warfare conducted in peacetime. Air Force maintenance crews claimed the tables nearest the windows, their blue uniforms a distinct island in a sea of camouflage. Marine infantry held the corner booths like contested territory, their desert marpat a declaration of expeditionary pride. And in the center, loud and proprietary, sat the men of the 75th Ranger Regiment. They were lords of this particular domain. Their multicam uniforms bore the scrolls and tabs that separated the merely enlisted from the truly elite. Combat infantry badges gleamed on their chests. Ranger scrolls curved across their shoulders like pieces of Holy Scripture. They moved through the dining facility with the swagger of men who knew they were dangerous and wanted everyone else to know it too. Staff Sergeant Marcus Keller sat at the head of the largest table, a Viking carved from North Carolina clay in 3 tours of hard lessons. At 35, he was old enough to have earned every inch of that Ranger scroll, and young enough to still believe in the myths it represented. A thin scar traced his jawline, a gift from an IED in Kandahar that had killed the man standing next to him and left Keller with nothing but this mark and the guilt that came with surviving. He was mid-story when she entered. Something about a firefight in the Hindu Kush that had probably been less dramatic in reality than in the retelling. His squad leaned in, listening with the attention of men who'd heard the story before, but knew their role in the ritual. Then the door opened, and a ghost walked in. She was small. That was the first thing anyone would notice. Perhaps 5'3", with an efficient frame that suggested capability rather than fragility. Her uniform was navy working green, sterile and unadorned. No unit patches, no deployment badges, no ribbons creating a colorful autobiography across her chest. Just the simple fouled anchor of a chief petty officer sitting on her collar. A rank that in this army-dominated space meant approximately nothing. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Cross carried her tray through the ecosystem like a foreigner navigating hostile territory without a map. She moved with a quiet purpose that could easily be mistaken for timidity by men who didn't know how to read movement. But there was something in her deliberate steps, the way she held the tray level without seeming to think about it, the manner in which her eyes swept the room in a pattern that was too systematic to be casual. Keller watched her without realizing he was watching. Some predatory instinct, perhaps. Or maybe just the boredom of a man looking for entertainment in the routine of garrison life. She found a small table against the far wall. Ghost territory, the space claimed by people who were new or alone or didn't understand the unwritten rules of military dining politics. She set her tray down with the same measured precision she'd used to carry it. From his vantage point in the corner, Master Chief Petty Officer James Callahan watched the scene develop with the weary prescience of a man who'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. At 58, his face was a relief map of deployments past. 3 decades in naval special warfare had taught him to recognize operators the way some men recognized makes of cars. The way she moved, the calluses on her hands visible even from across the room, the trigger finger on her right hand slightly more developed than the others, the way her eyes had swept the room, not in nervousness, but in tactical assessment. He knew who she was. More importantly, he knew what she was. And he knew the Rangers were about to step on a landmine they couldn't see. Elena was 3 bites into her meal when the shadows fell across her table. She didn't look up. She'd known they were coming before they stood, had tracked their approach in her peripheral vision, counted their footsteps, calculated the angle of their advance. 11 of them. They didn't form a perfect, menacing circle. It was clumsier than that, more casual, a swaggering encirclement that was somehow more insulting than overt aggression. It carried the confidence of men who believed they were teaching a lesson to someone too ignorant to know she needed teaching. Staff Sergeant Marcus Keller leaned his knuckles on her table. Up close, he was even more of a recruiting poster. 6'2" of muscle and conviction, shoulders that strained the fabric of his uniform. The Ranger scroll on his shoulder caught the fluorescent light like a badge of divine appointment. His combat infantry badge sat above it, immaculate. "Well, look what we have here." His voice boomed across the dining facility. Conversations at nearby tables stuttered and died. Heads turned. An audience materialized without anyone seeming to move. Behind Keller, his men arranged themselves with the practiced choreography of a pack that had hunted together before. Some grinned. Others maintained the stern expression of men backing up their sergeant's play. All of them watched the small woman at the table like she was a specimen in a jar. "A little sailor, lost at sea." The line got the laugh he wanted. Practiced, pack-like. The sound of men confirming their allegiance to the hierarchy. Elena didn't look up. She continued to eat. Fork to mouth. Chew. Swallow. Repeat. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, a violation of the social contract that Keller's presence demanded. His dominance required acknowledgement. Her silence was a defiance he couldn't comprehend. "Hey!" Louder now. His thick finger tapped the table next to her plate, the sound sharp in the quiet that had fallen over this section of the dining facility. "I'm talking to you." She finished chewing, swallowed, set her fork down with a soft click against the tray. Then she lifted her eyes. They were dark, steady, and they held no trace of the fear or anger he'd expected. They were simply observing, recording. She was looking at him the way a scientist might examine a particularly interesting insect, cataloging data, nothing more. Keller straightened slightly, thrown off his rhythm by this unexpected response. "You know who I am?" It wasn't really a question. The phrasing was interrogative, but the tone was declarative. A statement of dominance wrapped in the syntax of inquiry. "We're the 75th Ranger Regiment, tip of the damn spear." He paused, letting the weight of that settle. Around the dining facility, other Rangers had stopped eating. They watched their tribal champion establish territorial dominance over this interloper. "We just got back from a rotation that would make your little sailor buddies cry in their bunks." Behind him, one of his men snorted, the kind of derisive sound that needed no words. Keller leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that somehow carried across the room. "What do you do? Push papers on some ship?" The men behind him laughed. It was a practice sound, the laughter of subordinates who knew their lines in this performance. Some of it genuine, most of it theater. All of it designed to reinforce the pecking order. Elena's gaze flickered over them. One by one, she noted faces, the placement of patches, the casual arrogance in their postures, the way they stood just a little too close, making space feel scarce, making her small table feel even smaller. She counted them. 11, including Keller. She cataloged the information the way she cataloged everything. Data to be stored, analyzed, potentially acted upon. Her eyes returned to Keller. She gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Not a negation, not really, more of a dismissal. The gesture of someone deciding that a response wasn't worth the energy it would require. It was this, more than anything, that lit the fuse. Keller's face tightened. The smile that had been playing at the corners of his mouth vanished. He was accustomed to fear. At minimum, he expected deference. This serene disinterest was anathema to everything his world had taught him about dominance in submission. "Lost your tongue?" A younger Ranger behind Keller, trying too hard to match his leader's energy, leaned in. "Maybe she doesn't speak Army, Sarge. Probably only knows the difference between port and starboard." More laughter. Encouraged now, the pack smelling blood. Elena's eyes returned to Keller. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She checked her watch. It was a small gesture, clinical, like she was timing something, calculating, not nervous, not intimidated, just measuring. The gesture infuriated Keller in a way that words never could have. She wasn't engaging with his dominance display. She was treating him like an appointment that was running long, like he was making her late for something more important. With a swift, contemptuous motion, he swept his hand across her table. The tray, with its half-eaten meal, clattered to the floor. Food exploded across the linoleum. Juice splattered in an arc. A plastic fork skittered under an adjacent table. The noise was sharp, ugly, the sound of a line being crossed. The entire dining facility went silent. Every eye turned to the small table against the wall. Marines stopped mid-conversation. Air Force personnel froze with forks halfway to their mouths. Other Rangers, even those not part of Keller's immediate squad, watched to see what would happen next. This was the moment, the inflection point, the space where a response was expected. No, perhaps, even. Tears, perhaps. Anger, certainly. A shouted retort that would give Keller the confrontation he needed to justify what he'd just done. Anything that would validate his aggression and confirm the natural order he believed in. He waited for it, a smirk already forming on his lips. Chief Petty Officer Elena Cross looked at the mess on the floor. Tray overturned, food scattered like debris from an explosion, juice pooling in the grout lines between tiles. Then she looked at her watch again. Then she looked back at Keller. Her expression had not changed. It was like looking at a camera lens. No emotion, no judgment, just observation, recording, storing. Slowly she stood up. Her chair made a soft scraping sound against the floor, shockingly loud in the silence. She was a full head shorter than him. The physical disparity was almost comical. David and Goliath, if David had been a small woman in a Navy uniform, and Goliath had been a Ranger who just made the worst tactical decision of his military career. She bent down, picked up the fallen tray with movements that were efficient to the point of being mechanical. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge the 11 men surrounding her, simply performed the task at hand with the efficiency of someone completing a checklist. She walked past the silent group of soldiers. Her shoulder passed within inches of Keller's arm, but she didn't turn her head, didn't glance up, just walked with that same quiet purpose she'd entered with. She deposited the tray at the cleaning station, placed it on the conveyor with the same care she might have used for sensitive equipment. Then she walked toward the exit. The silence she left behind was heavier than any noise that had preceded it. It had weight, texture, the uncomfortable density of men realizing they just witnessed something they didn't fully understand. Keller's smirk faltered, died. He'd won the confrontation, established dominance, proved his point. But somehow it felt hollow, the victory of a man punching smoke. He'd expected a scene, validation, the confirmation that his power was real because it could provoke a reaction. Instead, he got nothing, just quiet observation and a clean exit. Around the dining facility, the murmuring started up again, but the tone had shifted. It wasn't amusement, it was discomfort. The sound of people not quite sure what they'd just seen, but certain it wasn't what it appeared to be. The Rangers returned to their table. Their laughter came back, but it was a little too loud now, a little too forced. They'd made their point, established territorial dominance, put the Navy in its place. But somehow, inexplicably, they felt like they'd lost. In the corner, Master Chief Callahan slowly shook his head. He picked up his tray, dumped it, and left through a side exit. There was nothing to do now but wait. The machine was in motion. The gears were turning, and Marcus Keller had just activated a sequence he couldn't possibly understand. The walk back to her quarters was short. Elena Cross moved through the evening air of Fort Bragg with the same measured precision she brought to everything. The base was settling into its twilight routine. Formations dismissed. Soldiers heading to the PX or the gym or their own quarters to collapse and pretend they weren't thinking about home. She reached her building, climbed the stairs, unlocked her door. The room was Spartan in the way that only military quarters could be. a bunk with sheets tucked to regulation tightness, a locker that contained exactly 3 identical uniforms, and the minimal civilian clothes she bothered to maintain. A desk, and on that desk, a hardened Pelican case. She sat down in the single chair. The adrenaline that had been held in check by iron discipline began to seep away, leaving behind the familiar clarity that came after confrontation. Not anger, never anger. Anger was noise in the signal. Anger was a vulnerability to be exploited. This was something else, something colder, more useful. She opened the Pelican case. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was a suite of electronics that hummed with quiet, potent energy. A matte black laptop, its casing non-reflective, bearing no logos or manufacturer marks. A satellite communication module, an encrypted hard drive, the tools of her actual trade. She powered on the laptop. A few keystrokes brought up a simple text interface on a secure, encrypted partition. The screen's glow was the only light in the room now. It painted her face in pale blue, turned her features into a study of shadow and determination. She began to type. Her report was devoid of emotion, a simple recitation of facts presented in the clinical language of military documentation. Log entry, 21,418. Bram Dining Facility, DFAC-2. 1842 hours, local. Verbal engagement initiated by U.S. Army Staff Sergeant, identified by uniform insignia as Keller, M. Subject assigned to 75th Ranger Regiment, 1st Battalion. Her fingers moved across the keys with the same efficiency she brought to every task. 1843 hours. Subject accompanied by 10 additional individuals from same unit. Verbal provocations centered on inter-service rivalry and gendered condescension. She paused, replaying the scene in her mind with perfect clarity. The way he'd leaned on the table, the angle of approach his men had used, the micro-expressions that had crossed his face when she didn't react the way he expected. 1845 hours. Subject escalated to physical action. Displaced personal meal tray. Intent appears to have been public humiliation. Objective assessed as successful from subject's perspective. Another pause. Her fingers hovered over the keys. 1846 hours. Disengaged from situation. No verbal response provided. All 11 individuals visually identified, logged for future reference. She saved the file. The encryption algorithm churned silently, wrapping her words in layers of mathematical protection that would take a supercomputer decades to crack. The act was a ritual of containment. She had taken the chaotic emotional energy of the encounter and transformed it into cold, hard data. Data could be stored, analyzed, acted upon. Emotion was just noise cluttering the frequency. Her preparation was not about retaliation. It was about recalibration, about ensuring that when the moment came, she would have the information she needed to respond with precision rather than passion. She opened another, smaller case. Inside, nestled in its own custom-cut foam, was a single circular patch. It was midnight blue, almost black. Embroidered on it in silver thread was a phoenix rising from stylized flames. The mythical bird's wings were spread wide, its head tilted back in what might have been triumph or agony or both. Beneath it, in subtle gray thread that would be invisible unless you knew to look for it, was a Latin motto. Fides in tenebris, faith in darkness. It was the unofficial emblem of a unit that did not officially exist. Project Trident, a name that appeared on no organizational charts, claimed no budget line items, and operated in the spaces between the wars that made headlines and the wars that didn't. Elena looked at it for a long moment. Her fingers traced the outline of the mythical bird. The embroidery was raised slightly, textured under her fingertips. It was a reminder of who she was beyond the sterile uniform and the assumptions of men like Keller. a symbol of rising from ashes, of finding signal in noise, of operating in the kind of darkness that had nothing to do with the absence of light and everything to do with the absence of certainty. She had earned this patch in ways that Marcus Keller, for all his scrolls and tabs, could never understand. In places that didn't appear on maps, against enemies that had no names. She closed the case. The soft click of the latches echoed in the quiet room, a small, definitive sound in the gathering dark. Her focus was restored. Her mission here was clear. She was at Fort Bragg to assess the base's electronic warfare vulnerabilities, to probe the defenses, to find the gaps in the armor, to write the report that would either validate their systems or expose their fatal flaws. The human element, she noted internally, was proving to be the most significant vulnerability of all. The next morning arrived with the particular quality of light that only military bases seem to produce. Something about the flat architecture and the wide spaces between buildings created a harshness to the dawn that felt appropriate to the enterprise of organized violence. Master Chief Petty Officer James Callahan found her in the anechoic chamber of the Signals Intelligence Building. The space was designed to absorb radio frequencies, preventing any external interference from contaminating the sensitive equipment housed within. It was like standing inside a giant foam-lined coffin. Sound behaved strangely here. Voices died before they could echo. Elena was calibrating a complex antenna array, her hands moving over the equipment with the confidence of someone who understood it at a molecular level. A laptop sat open beside her, displaying scrolling code that would have been meaningless to anyone without her specific expertise. Callahan was a relic from a different navy, a time before computers had dominated warfare, when signals intelligence meant Morse code and radio direction finding rather than quantum encryption and satellite intercepts. But he'd adapted, survived, learned, and in the process, he'd become one of the few people on the planet who understood what Project Trident actually did. More importantly, he was one of perhaps a dozen people who knew what that Phoenix patch represented. Heard there was some friction at the DFAC last night, Elena. He didn't call her by rank, not here, in private. They'd known each other too long, served in too many places that had no names. He'd been her first instructor when she'd arrived at Naval Special Warfare Development Group 12 years ago. Had watched her transform from a promising signals analyst into something far more dangerous. His voice was a low rumble, weathered by decades of shouting over helicopter rotors and radio static. Elena didn't turn from the antenna she was calibrating. Her hands continued their work, making minute adjustments to the positioning elements. "Situation is being monitored, Master Chief." Her tone was even, clinical, the same voice she'd used to report equipment status or weather conditions. Callahan nodded, though she couldn't see it. He understood her language. Monitored meant documented. It meant she was in control of the response, whatever that response would ultimately be. It meant he didn't need to intervene because she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever game was being played. "Keller's a peacock." He said it flatly, a simple statement of observed fact. All feathers, but a peacock with a Ranger tab is still a problem in certain contexts. Elena made a final adjustment to the antenna, checked the readings on her laptop. Satisfied, she straightened and finally turned to face him. "All data is useful, Master Chief." The corner of Callahan's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, just an acknowledgement that he'd taught her well. And that was the end of the conversation. He knew better than to push, knew better than to offer advice she didn't need or protection she wouldn't want. She was a weapon he'd helped forge. Now all he could do was trust that he'd done the job right. He gave her a single paternal nod and left her to her work. The anechoic foam swallowed the sound of his footsteps before he'd taken 3 steps. Elena turned back to her equipment, but her mind was already moving ahead, calculating, planning, not for revenge, never revenge, but for the inevitable moment when Marcus Keller's path and her capabilities would intersect. And when that moment came, she would be ready. The provocation, when it came, was as predictable as it was arrogant. Keller and his platoon were preparing for a major joint training exercise, Oracle Fury. It was designed to be the ultimate test of Ranger capabilities, a long-range raid on a high-value target, complicated by a sophisticated near-peer adversary providing electronic warfare support in cyber attacks. Scenarios testing not just their trigger skills, but their ability to operate when all their technological advantages had been stripped away. It was, in short, exactly the mission that would expose any weaknesses in their communications infrastructure. Which is why Elena Cross had been temporarily assigned to provide technical support. Had been, until Staff Sergeant Keller decided to solve that particular problem. She found out about it in the motor pool, where she was interfacing with the communication suite on a command and control vehicle. The vehicle was essentially a mobile operations center, packed with enough radio equipment and computer systems to coordinate a small war. She had a diagnostic probe connected to a data port, her tablet displaying scrolling lines of code as she assessed the vehicle's signal shielding and frequency security. The sun was climbing toward noon, turning the motor pool into a griddle. Heat shimmered off the pavement. The smell of diesel and hot metal hung in the air. Keller approached with two of his men flanking him. His swagger was back, amplified by the perceived victory in the dining hall. He'd established dominance, put the Navy in its place. Now he could afford to be magnanimous, or at least he could afford to pretend at magnanimity while really just twisting the knife. Well, the mighty Navy's here to polish the antennas. He drawled the words, letting them carry across the motor pool. A few other soldiers looked up from their work. An audience was always important. He walked closer, his eyes on the tablet in her hands. The screen displayed complex signal analysis, frequency maps, encryption protocols. To him, it probably looked like incomprehensible squiggles. "Hey, little sailor, think you can get our comms up for the big show? We need our radios to be extra loud and clear so we can call for air support." He paused, letting the implication hang. The Rangers didn't need air support. The Rangers were the support that got called. The suggestion that they might need saving was its own form of insult. Or is that too much for the Navy's finest paper pusher? He reached out and plucked the tablet from her hands. It was a flagrant breach of protocol. You didn't touch another operator's sensitive equipment. Period. It violated a dozen different security regulations and about 1,000 unwritten rules of professional conduct. But Keller wasn't thinking about protocol. He was thinking about dominance, about reinforcing yesterday's lesson, about making sure this little Navy chief understood her place in the hierarchy. He pretended to study the screen, his brow furrowing in exaggerated confusion. "Lots of squiggly lines here. You sure you know what you're doing?" Elena's hand, the one that had been holding the device, remained in the air for a fraction of a second, suspended in the space where the tablet had been. Then she slowly lowered it to her side. Her eyes were fixed on his face. "That is classified diagnostic equipment, Staff Sergeant." Her voice was flat, without inflection, but the use of his full rank was a subtle blade, a reminder that ranks existed, that protocols mattered, that he was currently violating both. Keller laughed and tossed the tablet back to her. She caught it effortlessly, her hands moving with reflexes that came from training most people would never understand. "Classified, right. Relax, Chief." He emphasized the rank with just enough edge to make it sound like an insult. "We're all on the same team here, just making sure the support staff is up to snuff for the real operators." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that his men could still hear. "You got a problem with my methods, Chief? You feeling uncooperative again?" He was baiting her, manufacturing a confrontation he could report, creating the paper trail he needed to justify what he was about to do. Elena said nothing, just held his gaze with those dark, steady eyes that gave away absolutely nothing. Keller straightened, a satisfied smirk on his face. He'd gotten what he came for, Another non-response he could spin as insubordination. Another data point in his narrative of the uncooperative Navy technician who couldn't handle working with real soldiers. He walked away, his men following, laughing, already composing the story they'd tell later. Elena stood in the motor pool heat, tablet in hand, and watched them go. Then she calmly disconnected her diagnostic probe, packed her equipment, and returned to her workspace. By 1400 hours, the formal complaint had been filed. At 1530 hours, a nervous second lieutenant found her cataloging signal emitters on the base perimeter. He was perhaps 23, fresh out of officer training, and clearly uncomfortable with the errand he'd been assigned. Chief Petty Officer Cross? He consulted a clipboard, not quite meeting her eyes. "Ma'am, I have a report here from Staff Sergeant Keller of the 1st Ranger Battalion." He paused, swallowed. "He's filed a formal complaint. It states that you were, and I'm quoting, uncooperative and displayed a hostile attitude when he requested assistance with his platoon's communication equipment." Elena looked at the young officer. He was just a messenger, a kid caught between NCOs playing games he didn't understand. She felt no anger toward him. "Understood, Lieutenant. He's requesting that you be reassigned from any support role related to his unit during the upcoming Oracle Fury exercise." The lieutenant's voice was getting quieter, like he was embarrassed to be delivering this message. "Command has provisionally approved it pending review. You're to remain in the operations center and provide general network monitoring only, no direct support to Ranger elements." It was a deliberate, calculated move. Keller was using the institutional machinery to sideline her, to put her in a box labeled problematic support personnel, to punish her for the crime of not respecting him in the manner he felt he deserved. He was weaponizing the very system she dedicated her life to serving. "Thank you for the notification, sir." Elena's voice was perfectly neutral, professional. She turned back to her work as if the conversation had been about something as mundane as a schedule change. The lieutenant lingered for a moment, looking like he wanted to say something else, maybe apologize, maybe explain that he was just following orders. But Elena didn't look at him again, and eventually he walked away, relieved to be done with an uncomfortable task. Alone again, Elena continued her work. But her mind was already processing the new information, integrating it into the larger picture she was building. She had the pattern now, the complete data set, the initial confrontation in the dining facility, the escalation at the motor pool, the formal complaint weaponizing institutional processes. Keller had painted himself into a corner. He'd created a paper trail that documented his bias. He'd manufactured a conflict where none needed to exist. And most importantly, he'd removed the one person on this base who could save him from what was coming. That night, Elena sat in her quarters and opened the encrypted files for Exercise Oracle Fury. The scenario was complex, detailed. A sophisticated enemy force equipped with cutting-edge electronic warfare capabilities, threats that could blind and deafen an entire unit, turning their technological advantages into liabilities. As she read through the technical specifications, a small, cold smile touched her lips. She recognized this threat profile, not because she'd read about it in a report, because she'd encountered it before, in person, under fire. In a valley in Lebanon 2 years ago where everything had gone wrong, and she'd learned exactly how these systems worked by watching them kill people she'd been supposed to protect. The jamming architecture in the Oracle Fury scenario was based on her own after-action report, her own analysis, the threat assessment she'd written after that mission, purchased with blood and failure and lessons you learn when you survive something you shouldn't have. Someone had taken her work and turned it into a training scenario, which meant Oracle Fury wasn't just a test of Ranger capabilities. It was a test of whether Fort Bragg's communications infrastructure could withstand the kind of sophisticated attack that real adversaries were now capable of deploying. And Marcus Keller had just ensured that the one person who truly understood this threat would be watching from the sidelines. Elena closed the files, opened the small case containing the Phoenix patch, looked at the silver bird rising from flames, the Latin motto beneath, Fides in Tenebris. She closed the case. The soft click was definitive in the quiet room. Then she opened a new file and began to type. Not a report this time, a prediction. She detailed exactly how the exercise would unfold, how the jamming would manifest, how the base's organic electronic warfare systems would fail to adapt, how Keller's platoon would find themselves blind and deaf in hostile territory with no way to call for help. She documented the vulnerabilities she'd already identified in Fort Bragg's communications architecture, the gaps in their defensive posture, the assumptions built into their systems that a sophisticated adversary could exploit. And she outlined in precise technical detail exactly how she would defeat the threat if she were given the opportunity. When she was finished, she encrypted the file and saved it with a timestamp. Then she went to bed, not because she was tired, but because there was nothing left to do but wait. The machine was in motion now. The gears were turning. Marcus Keller had activated a sequence he couldn't understand, let alone control. In 3 days, exercise Oracle Fury would begin. In 3 days, 11 Rangers would learn what it meant to underestimate a ghost. In 3 days, the correction would begin. But tonight, in her Spartan quarters on Fort Bragg, Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Cross slept the dreamless sleep of someone who knew exactly what was coming and was perfectly prepared for it. The only question that remained was whether Marcus Keller would survive the lesson with his career intact. Elena suspected not, but that wasn't her concern. Her concern was the mission. Always the mission. And the mission was about to get very interesting indeed. 3 days could feel like an eternity or an eye blink, depending on what waited at the end of them. For Staff Sergeant Marcus Keller, those 3 days passed in a blur of final preparations, equipment checks, and the particular brand of controlled chaos that preceded any major training exercise. For Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Cross, those same 3 days were a study in patience and precision. She completed her assessment of Fort Bragg's electronic warfare vulnerabilities. She documented every gap in their defensive architecture. She prepared her workspace in the operations center with the methodical care of a surgeon arranging instruments before a complex procedure. And she waited. Exercise Oracle Fury was scheduled to kick off at 0600 hours on a Thursday morning that dawned clear and cold. A morning that made North Carolina feel more like its mountain heritage than its coastal proximity. Frost edged the grass around the operations center. Beth misted in the air as soldiers moved through the pre-dawn darkness, finalizing their preparations. The operations center itself was a cavern of controlled chaos even before the exercise officially began. It occupied the entire ground floor of a reinforced concrete building that had been designed to survive anything short of a direct nuclear strike. Inside, the space was dominated by a massive holographic map table that could display terrain, force positions, and tactical data in 3 dimensions. Surrounding it were tiered workstations for different functional areas: communications, intelligence, fires coordination, electronic warfare, logistics. Screens covered every wall, displaying everything from weather data to satellite imagery to live feeds from drone cameras that weren't actually live because this was just training. But the technology was real enough. Colonel David Harrison stood on the command platform overlooking the main floor, a coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other. At 52, he was old enough to remember when operations centers looked completely different, when maps were paper and updates came via radio rather than real-time data links. He'd adapted, learned to trust the technology even when his instincts screamed that nothing could replace boots on the ground and eyes on the target. He was an infantryman at heart, had earned his commission through ROTC, spent his entire career in combat arms units, worked his way up through company command and battalion command to this posting as Fort Bragg's deputy commander for training. He'd seen combat in Iraq, Afghanistan, a dozen places that didn't make the news. He knew what real war looked like, which made him take training seriously in a way that some officers didn't. Elena arrived at the operations center at 0530 hours, early enough to be professional, not so early as to seem overeager. She wore her working uniform, her hair pulled back in the tight bun that regulations required. The rank insignia on her collar caught the overhead lights. Chief Petty Officer, the simple, fouled anchor. Not the star that should have been there, denoting Senior Chief, because that promotion hadn't been officially presented yet. Administrative delays, bureaucratic friction, the normal dysfunction of a military that moved faster in combat than it did in peacetime. She made her way to the auxiliary station where she'd been assigned. It was tucked in a corner, away from the main action. A single workstation with access to the network monitoring systems, but not much else. A position you'd give to someone you wanted present, but not involved. Visible, but not valuable. Exactly where Keller had wanted her. She sat down, logged into her terminal, began running basic network diagnostics that were part of her assigned monitoring duties. To anyone watching, she was simply doing her job. A competent technician performing routine tasks. But on a secondary screen, one angled away from casual observation, she had pulled up a spectral analyzer that nobody had told her to access. This system displayed the raw electromagnetic spectrum, showing every radio frequency transmission happening within range of Fort Bragg's sensor array. It was data in its most primitive form, unprocessed, unfiltered, just the pure signal environment rendered as a cascading waterfall of colors representing different frequencies and power levels. Most people found it incomprehensible, a blizzard of visual noise. To Elena, it was a language she spoke fluently. At 600 hours precisely, Exercise Oracle Fury officially began. On the holographic map table, blue icons representing Keller's Ranger platoon appeared at their insertion point. 12 men total, including Keller. They'd been flown in by helicopter to a drop-off point 30 kilometers from their objective, inserted under the cover of darkness that was now giving way to dawn. Their mission was straightforward on paper. Infiltrate to a target compound. Neutralize or capture a high-value individual. Exfiltrate before enemy quick reaction forces could respond. Standard Special Operations raid profile. The complication was the opposing force, played by a dedicated training unit equipped with a kind of sophisticated technology that near-peer adversaries actually possessed, including electronic warfare capabilities that could blind, deafen, and confuse even the most advanced units. Raider 6, this is Warhorse 6, radio check. Colonel Harrison's voice came through the speakers mounted around the operations center. Calm, professional. The voice of a commander who'd done this 1,000 times. Warhorse 6, Raider 6, good copy. All systems green, beginning movement to phase line Alpha. Keller's voice was confident, steady. Whatever else he might be, the man was a competent tactical leader. His Rangers began moving across the terrain, their blue icons creeping across the holographic display with the deliberate pace of professionals who knew how to balance speed with security. The first hour passed smoothly, too smoothly, Elena thought. She watched the spectral display, noting the patterns of friendly communications. The Rangers were using standard encrypted radios, frequency hopping across a predetermined pattern. Nothing sophisticated, but adequate for training purposes. The opposing force wasn't transmitting yet. They were waiting, watching, letting the Rangers get deeper into the kill zone before springing the trap. At 0710 hours, Keller's platoon reached phase line Bravo, the halfway point to their objective. They'd made good time, moved tactically, everything by the book. Warhorse 6, Raider 6, phase line Bravo, continuing mission. Roger, Raider 6, no change to intel picture. Target compound shows normal activity. Around the operations center, Officers and senior NCOs monitored their respective areas of responsibility. The atmosphere was focused but relaxed. This was training, controlled, predictable. Elena's eyes never left her spectral analyzer. At 0742 hours, she saw the first anomaly. It was subtle, a brief spike in the background noise level across multiple frequency bands, lasting less than a second. Most people would have dismissed it as atmospheric interference or a glitch in the sensor array. Elena knew better. She opened a secondary analysis window, isolating that moment, running it through pattern recognition algorithms that existed in her head more than in any software. There, a handshake, two nodes synchronizing their clocks, preparing to coordinate their transmissions. The digital equivalent of two soldiers checking their watches before executing a coordinated ambush. The trap was about to spring. At 0748 hours, the world ended for Marcus Keller and his Rangers. The change was instantaneous and absolute. One moment they had crystal clear communications, GPS tracking, and full situational awareness. The next moment, they had nothing. Static erupted across every frequency simultaneously. Not the random static of interference, but something more aggressive, more intelligent. A wall of noise that seemed to anticipate and counter every attempt to find a clear channel. In the operations center, the effect was equally dramatic. Warning klaxons began to wail. Red alerts cascaded across multiple screens. The communications officer, a young captain who'd been looking confident 30 seconds ago, began shouting updates that were really just descriptions of catastrophe. Loss of signal with radar element. All frequencies compromised. Attempting alternate channels. On the holographic display, the blue icons representing Keller's platoon flickered. Their position data, fed by GPS and transmitted via encrypted radio, simply stopped updating. The icons froze in place, then began to fade as the computer system lost confidence in their accuracy. 12 men had just vanished into the electromagnetic dark. "What the hell is happening?" Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the rising chaos. Not shouting, not panicking, but demanding answers with command presence that made people want to give him answers, even when they didn't have any. Major David Peterson stood at the electronic warfare station, his hands flying across his console. At 45, Peterson was the base's senior EW officer, a man who'd built his entire career on understanding the electromagnetic spectrum. He had a master's degree from MIT. He'd written papers on frequency hopping algorithms and adaptive jamming techniques. He was, by any objective measure, an expert, and his expertise was currently worth nothing. Massive jamming, sir. Broad spectrum, high power, adaptive. Every time we try to find a clear frequency, it's already there. It's hopping in a pattern we can't track. He pulled up the spectral display on the main screen. The visualization that appeared made several people in the operations center actually gasp. The waterfall display showed a cascade of angry red and yellow energy. Every frequency band that should have been blue or green, indicating clear channels for friendly communications, was instead drowning in a sea of hostile signal. It was a digital tsunami, overwhelming every defense they had. Can we counter it? Harrison's question was directed at Peterson, but the major was already shaking his head. "We're trying, sir, but this is beyond anything in the exercise scenario. This is graduate-level EW, professional-grade capabilities. I don't understand how the OPFOR is generating this kind of power and sophistication." Minutes ticked by. 3, 5, 8. Each one an eternity for the Rangers on the ground, who were operating completely blind, and an agony for the officers in the operations center, who were supposed to be controlling this exercise, but were instead watching it spiral into chaos. At 0757 hours, a brief transmission broke through. It came on a high-frequency emergency channel, a last-ditch backup that required line of sight in manual operation. The transmission quality was terrible, the signal weak and intermittent, but Keller's voice was unmistakable. "Warhorse, Raider 6, taking simulated fire, multiple positions, completely pinned. Static swallowed half his words, but the message was clear enough. Cannot maneuver, cannot communicate, multiple simulated casualties. We are in the kill box. The transmission died. Didn't fade, didn't degrade, just cut off mid-word as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed was profound. Colonel Harrison's face had gone from stern to grim. This wasn't training anymore. This was a catastrophic failure of his command's technical capabilities. In a real combat scenario, those 12 Rangers would be dead or captured. The mission would be a complete failure, and it would be his responsibility. His eyes scanned the frantic activity in the operations center. Technicians were shouting updates at each other. Officers were running diagnostic protocols. Major Peterson was coordinating counter-jamming efforts that were accomplishing exactly nothing. Nobody had answers. Everyone had excuses. And then Harrison saw her. In a quiet corner of the operations center, away from the main chaos, sat Chief Petty Officer Elena Cross. She wasn't panicking, wasn't shouting, wasn't frantically typing commands into her terminal. She was simply watching a screen that nobody else was looking at. Her expression was one of intense concentration. Her eyes moved across the display in a pattern that suggested she was reading something, understanding something, finding signal in the noise. Harrison made a decision separating adequate commanders from good ones. When your experts failed, you look for someone who might succeed. He stepped down from the command platform and walked directly toward her station. Conversations died as people noticed the colonel moving with purpose. Eyes followed him across the operations center floor. Elena didn't turn, didn't acknowledge his approach. Her focus remained absolute on the spectral analyzer display in front of her. Harrison stopped at her workstation, looked at the screen, saw absolutely nothing that made sense to him, just cascading colors and incomprehensible patterns. Chief Cross. She turned then, met his eyes, and Harrison, who'd been commanding soldiers for 3 decades, felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. There was no fear in those eyes, no uncertainty, just calm assessment and absolute confidence. "Sir, can you tell me what's happening to my Rangers?" It was phrased as a question, but they both knew it was really a plea. A commander asking for help from a subordinate because rank meant nothing when your people were dying, even if it was just simulated dying in a training exercise. Elena glanced back at her screen, then returned her gaze to Harrison. "The jamming is not a single source, Colonel. That's what your systems are trying to tell you, what everyone is assuming, but it's incorrect." Across the operations center, Major Peterson had noticed the conversation. He began moving toward them, his expression defensive. "That's impossible, Chief. All our systems show a single high-powered source broadcasting from these coordinates." He gestured toward the main holographic display, where a pulsing red icon indicated the location his systems had triangulated for the jamming source. Elena didn't even glance at him. Her attention remained fixed on Colonel Harrison. "Your systems are analyzing the symptoms, sir, not the architecture. The jamming appears to be coming from a single source because that's what it's designed to appear to be, but it's not." She turned back to her screen, fingers moving over her keyboard with rapid precision. "It's a decentralized 3-node network. The primary node is here." She pulled up a tactical map overlay and touched a location on her screen. When she transferred the image to the main holographic display, a new icon appeared. A small, pulsing red dot in a patch of empty desert, miles away from where Peterson's systems had indicated. "The signal is being triangulated from the handshake latency residuals between the nodes. The delay is minute, less than a nanosecond, but it's measurable if you know where to look." Peterson's face had gone from defensive to shocked. He was staring at the new icon on the map, then at his own displays, trying to understand how he'd missed this. The secondary and tertiary nodes are here and here. 2 more icons appeared on the holographic map. Together, the three formed a triangle that surrounded Keller's last known position. They're providing polymorphic cover and broadcasting a false carrier wave that's blinding your equipment. The primary node is directing the operation. The other two are providing the overwhelming signal strength that's masking the coordination traffic. The operations center had gone completely silent. Every person in the room was listening to the small Navy chief explain, in calm technical terms, what their multi-million-dollar electronic warfare suite had failed to detect. Colonel Harrison felt something crystallize in his mind, a suspicion becoming certainty. "On what authority do you have this information, Chief?" The question hung in the air. It was the pivot point, the moment where everything would either make sense or dissolve into more confusion. Elena met his gaze, and for the first time since he'd approached her, he saw something shift in her expression. Not uncertainty, more like a decision being made, a mask being removed. "Authority of Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Project Trident, sir." The name landed in the room like a physical object. Several of the more senior officers and NCOs went very still. Project Trident was a ghost story, a rumor, the unit that people whispered about but nobody actually knew anything concrete about, except Colonel Harrison did know. He'd been read into certain programs during his time commanding a joint special operations task force in Syria. He'd never worked directly with Trident personnel, but he'd seen the results of their operations. He knew they existed, knew what they did, and suddenly everything made sense. The quiet competence, the way she moved, the calluses on her hands, the absolute confidence in her technical assessment. This wasn't a support technician who'd been assigned to Fort Bragg for routine duties. This was an operator, a specialist, someone who fought wars in the electromagnetic spectrum the way Rangers fought them with rifles and grenades. And Marcus Keller had tried to humiliate her in a dining facility. "Can you stop it?" Harrison's question was simple, direct. A commander who just found a potential solution to an impossible problem. "I can neutralize the external node, sir. Request authorization for targeted kinetic strike. Remote Weapons System 4 is available. It's equipped with a .338 Norma Magnum platform." Peterson made a strangled sound. "Sir, we can't just start shooting at exercise equipment. The cost alone." Harrison cut him off with a gesture. "Major, 12 of my Rangers are currently simulating being dead in a kill zone because our systems failed. I don't care about equipment costs. I care about mission success." He turned back to Elena. "You have authorization, Chief. Make the shot." Elena nodded once. She stood from her workstation and moved to a hardened terminal on the edge of the command platform. This was the control station for Fort Bragg's remote weapon systems, unmanned platforms that could be used for perimeter security, or in this case, for training scenarios that required precision engagement. She sat down at the terminal. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. Not in training, in actual combat. The main display switched to show the view from a high-powered optic mounted atop a remote weapons tower. The image showed desert terrain, rocks and scrub vegetation, heat haze distorting the air. Elena didn't use the joystick to search, didn't scan across the landscape looking for her target. She simply typed in coordinates, numbers that existed in her head, derived from the spectral analysis she'd been conducting. The camera slewed with a mechanical whine. Servos adjusted the angle. The view zoomed in with startling speed and precision. And there, in the middle of what appeared to be empty desert, was something. To most people, it would have looked like nothing, just rocks and heat shimmer. But Elena adjusted the magnification one more time, and the outline became visible. A small directional antenna, camouflaged to blend with the surrounding terrain, its dish angled to optimize its jamming effect. "Target identified." Her voice was calm, clinical, the tone of a surgeon announcing that she'd found the tumor. Around the operations center, people had stopped pretending to work. Everyone was watching the drama unfold on the main screen. Elena's hands moved across the keyboard, She wasn't using the simplified fire control interface designed for the system. She was accessing the underlying ballistic calculation software, manually inputting data with a speed that suggested she'd done these calculations so many times they were muscle memory. Range 2,850 meters. Her voice was a steady monotone, a stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded this moment. Wind 7 knots, variable from 290. She typed more numbers. Coriolis effect calculated for latitude and azimuth. More keystrokes. Her eyes never left the screen. Updraft from valley floor thermal differential requires elevation adjustment of plus +0.2 mils. She made a final entry. Time of flight 3.8 seconds. Her finger moved to the firing control. She didn't hesitate, didn't double check, didn't look to Colonel Harrison for final confirmation. She simply pressed the button. A single, sharp crack echoed from the speakers mounted around the operations center. On the screen, the view remained unchanged for exactly 3.8 seconds. The desert sat still and quiet under the morning sun. Then a tiny puff of dust erupted precisely where the camouflaged antenna had been. A brief shimmer in the air, visible only because they were looking for it. The flicker of electronics shattering under kinetic impact. And then, nothing. In the operations center, the effect was instantaneous and absolute. The wall of red and yellow on the spectral display vanished. Not gradually, not in stages. It simply disappeared, as if someone had thrown a switch. The waterfall returned to its normal pattern of blues and greens, showing the electromagnetic spectrum as it should be. Clear, navigable, friendly. The static that had been roaring from every speaker cut off, replaced by the clean hiss of an open channel. And then, crystal clear and absolutely unmistakable, Marcus Keller's voice burst through. "All stations, this is Raider 6. We have comms. All channels clear. What the hell just happened?" There was confusion in his voice, but also relief. The relief of a man who'd been drowning and had just broken the surface. "Command, be advised, enemy emitters are down. I say again, emitters are down. Requesting status and further instructions." Colonel Harrison keyed his microphone. "Raider 6, Warhorse 6, continue to objective. Good work recovering from the EW attack. Roger, continuing mission." There was a pause. Then Keller's voice returned, confused. "Warhorse 6, we've reached Objective Alpha. But sir, the target building is empty. No OP4, no HVT. It's completely abandoned." Harrison and Elena exchanged a glance. She saw understanding dawn on the colonel's face. The exercise scenario had listed a high-value target at Objective Alpha, but there had never been one. The entire raid mission was just cover. The real test had always been the electronic warfare vulnerability assessment. Keller's Rangers had been bait from the beginning. A live stress test of Fort Bragg's EW capabilities under combat conditions. And they'd failed catastrophically, until Elena saved them. "Raider 6, understood," Harrison said slowly. "Consolidate at Objective Alpha. Prepare for exfil. Exercise complete." "Roger, Warhorse 6, Raider 6 out." The confusion in Keller's voice was palpable. He'd led his platoon on a mission to capture a target that didn't exist. And he still had no idea that the woman whose meal he'd swept to the floor was the only reason he wasn't cataloged as a catastrophic training failure. Colonel Harrison stood on the command platform, staring at the spectral display that now showed complete communications dominance. He looked at the remote weapons feed, showing the small crater where an antenna had been. He looked at the holographic map, where the blue icons representing Keller's platoon had reappeared, updating in real time now that their GPS and communications were restored. And then he looked at Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Cross, who had just accomplished something that should have been impossible. She had identified a sophisticated multi-node jamming network using nothing but pattern recognition and signal analysis. She had calculated a precise firing solution for a target nearly 3 kilometers away. She had executed a single shot that had neutralized the primary node and caused the entire network to collapse. She had done in 10 minutes what his entire electronic warfare section hadn't been able to do in an hour of desperate trying. Around the operations center, the stunned silence was giving way to a different kind of activity. People returning to their stations, resuming their functions, but now with a sense of profound unease. The realization settling in that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, and that they had catastrophically underestimated the small woman standing at the remote weapons terminal. Major Peterson looked from his displays to Elena and back again. His face had gone through several shades of pale. His professional understanding of electronic warfare had just been thoroughly dismantled by someone he'd dismissed as a junior technician. The Rangers who'd been present at the dining facility incident stood in various positions around the operations center, their faces showing different stages of dawning horror. They were putting pieces together. The quiet chief they'd mocked, the technical competence she'd just displayed, the clearance level implied by Project Trident, the realization that they had harassed someone who operated at a level they couldn't even comprehend. On the ground 30 kilometers away, Marcus Keller was reorganizing his platoon, running communications checks, trying to understand what had just happened to turn their impossible situation into a salvage mission. He had no idea that his salvation had come from the woman whose meal he'd swept onto a dining facility floor 3 days ago. But he would. Colonel Harrison was already planning the debrief, already composing the report that would go up his chain of command, already thinking about the conversation he needed to have with whoever had sent Senior Chief Cross to his base without properly briefing him on who and what she was. But first, he had an exercise to complete. Raider 6, Warhorse 6, continue mission. Enemy EW threat has been neutralized. You are cleared to proceed to objective. Roger, Warhorse 6, continuing mission. Raider 6, out. The professionalism was back in Keller's voice, the confidence. He was back in his element, leading his Rangers toward their target, the crisis already being compartmentalized and filed away for later analysis. Elena returned to her auxiliary workstation, logged out of the remote weapons terminal, sat down at her original station as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But on her secondary screen, the spectral analyzer continued to display the electromagnetic environment, and she continued to watch it with the same absolute focus she'd maintained throughout the entire crisis. Because her mission wasn't complete, not yet. She'd identified the vulnerability, demonstrated the solution, proven that Fort Bragg's organic electronic warfare capabilities were inadequate against sophisticated threats. But there was still data to collect, still patterns to analyze, still work to be done. The exercise would continue for another 6 hours. Keller's Rangers would successfully reach their objective, conduct their raid, and exfiltrate. It would be counted as a successful mission, with the asterisk that they'd required outside intervention to overcome the EW threat. But the real story, the real lesson, wouldn't be apparent until the after-action review, when everyone would gather to discuss what had happened, when the truth about Elena Cross would be revealed not just to Colonel Harrison, but to everyone who'd been in that dining facility, when Marcus Keller would finally understand the magnitude of his mistake. Elena checked her watch, calculated timelines, made mental notes for her final report. In the corner of her workstation, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, sat the small case containing the Phoenix patch. Fides in tenebris, faith in darkness. She'd operated in darkness before, in places where the lights went out and stayed out, where the only thing you could trust was your training and your team and your absolute refusal to quit. This was different. This was darkness of a different kind. The darkness of being underestimated, dismissed, treated as less than. But the principle was the same. Have faith, do the work, let the results speak. The correction had begun, but it wasn't complete, not yet. The sun had set and risen again before the formal debrief was convened. 48 hours, time enough for exercise Oracle Fury to be completed, after action reports to be compiled, and for Colonel Harrison to make certain phone calls to certain people in certain offices that had no official addresses. The main conference room at Fort Bragg was designed for exactly this kind of gathering. Long table, high-backed chairs, American flag in the corner, secure communications terminal on the wall. Windows that were actually reinforced, blast-resistant panels designed to survive anything short of artillery fire. It was 0900 hours on a Saturday morning when they assembled. Colonel Harrison sat at the head of the table, his uniform pressed to razor sharpness, his expression carved from granite. To his right sat Master Chief Callahan, present as the senior Naval Special Warfare representative on base. The old sailor's weathered face was carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes, not quite satisfaction, more like the look of a man watching a play he'd seen before and knowing exactly how it ended. Major Peterson occupied a chair further down, looking like a man who'd spent the last 2 days reassessing every assumption he'd ever made about his field of expertise. His technical reports sat in front of him, meticulously prepared, professionally presented, and utterly damning in their conclusions. And then there were the Rangers. Staff Sergeant Marcus Keller stood at attention near the back wall, his uniform immaculate, his bearing military correct. But the confidence that had defined him 3 days ago was gone, replaced by something harder to read. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. Behind him stood 10 more Rangers, the same 10 who'd surrounded a small table in the dining facility, who'd laughed when their sergeant had swept a tray to the floor, who'd thought they were teaching a lesson to someone who needed to learn her place. They stood now with the rigid posture of men who knew they were in serious trouble, but didn't yet understand the full scope of it. At the far end of the table sat Chief Petty Officer Elena Cross. Her posture was relaxed, not slouching, but not the rigid formality of the Rangers behind her. She'd positioned herself where she could see everyone in the room without turning her head. Old habits from operating in environments where situational awareness meant survival. On the wall, the video teleconference screen was active. The image was crystal clear, high definition, encrypted through channels that had more security protocols than most classified weapons systems. The woman on the screen was Navy Rear Admiral Catherine Valdez, 55 years old, silver stars on her collar, ribbons covering a substantial portion of her uniform, each one representing a deployment, a commendation, a piece of history written in service and sacrifice. Her face had the kind of hardness that came from making decisions where wrong answers got people killed. She was currently the Deputy Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, and she did not look pleased. Colonel Harrison opened the proceedings with the kind of formal language that military bureaucracy demanded. This after-action review convenes at 0900 hours for exercise Oracle Fury, conducted at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, dates of execution November 14th through 16th. Present are key personnel involved in planning, execution, and resolution of critical incidents during said exercise. He paused, glanced at his notes, then continued in a voice that had shifted from bureaucratic to something more personal. The after-action report for this exercise has highlighted 2 critical points. First, a significant and catastrophic failure in our organic electronic warfare detection and countermeasure capabilities when faced with a polymorphic, decentralized adversary employing graduate-level jamming techniques. Major Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Second, a singular and decisive success in the neutralization of that same threat, accomplished by personnel not originally assigned to direct support roles. Harrison's eyes moved to Elena, then away. The implication was clear to everyone in the room. However, this review must also address a personnel issue that occurred prior to the exercise and directly impacted the command structure and support allocation for Ranger elements. Now he looked directly at Keller. Staff Sergeant Keller, You filed a formal complaint against Chief Petty Officer Cross on November 12th, citing insubordination and an uncooperative attitude when you requested technical assistance for your platoon's communication equipment. Keller's jaw tightened. His voice, when he spoke, had lost all its swagger. Yes, sir, that is correct. You further requested that she be removed from any direct support role related to your unit during Oracle Fury. Yes, sir, and command approved this request, pending review. Yes, sir. Harrison let that sit for a moment, let the weight of it settle on everyone present. Then he picked up a remote control and pointed it at the wall screen. The image split. Admiral Valdez remained on one half. On the other, security camera footage began to play. The timestamp showed November 11th, 1842 hours. The location designation read DFAC-2. The footage was silent but devastatingly clear. High-definition cameras designed to monitor dining facility operations for safety and security captured everything in perfect detail. 11 Rangers approaching a single table. A small woman in Navy uniform eating alone. The body language unmistakable even without sound. Aggressive posturing, leaning over the table, invading personal space. The woman not responding, not engaging, simply continuing to eat. And then the sweep of Keller's hand, the tray clattering to the floor, food scattering. The woman standing, cleaning up, walking away without a word while 11 Rangers watched her go. The footage played in a loop, 3 times, 4, each repetition more damning than the last. The silence in the conference room was absolute, silence that had physical weight, that pressed down on everyone present with the force of judgment rendered and sentence pending. Keller's face had gone through several shades of pale, from the normal tan of someone who spent time outdoors to something approaching chalk. His men behind him looked equally stricken. This was the moment where their actions, which had seemed justified or at least defensible in the heat of the moment, were being displayed for what they actually were. Bullying, harassment, conduct unbecoming. Admiral Valdez spoke for the first time. Her voice came through the speakers with absolute clarity and zero warmth. Staff Sergeant Keller, he flinched as if struck. Yes, ma'am. Your complaint against Chief Cross has been reviewed at the highest levels of both Naval Special Warfare Command and United States Army Special Operations Command. So has this security footage. So have witness statements from Master Chief Callahan and other personnel present at the time. She paused, and in that pause was the weight of an institution preparing to bring its full power to bear. You and the 10 men standing behind you will be facing non-judicial punishment hearings under Article 15 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The charges will include conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer and harassment of a fellow service member. Your command chain can consider itself fortunate that I am not recommending full court-martial proceedings. Keller's world was crumbling. Elena could see it in the micro-expressions crossing his face. The realization that his career, which he'd built through years of hard service and harder training, was now hanging by a thread. One of the younger Rangers behind him made a sound. Not quite a sob, not quite a gasp, just the noise of someone realizing they'd made a catastrophic mistake. Admiral Valdez wasn't finished. Let me provide some context that you and your men seem to be so profoundly lacking. She leaned forward slightly, her face filling more of the screen. The woman you chose to harass is not a clerk. She is not a support technician. She is not any of the things you assume she was, based on her rank insignia and her quiet demeanor. Elena sat perfectly still. Her expression hadn't changed, but something in her posture suggested she knew what was coming and had made peace with it. She is Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Cross, the lead technical analyst and senior field operator for Naval Special Warfare Development Group's Project Trident. The name landed like a bomb. For those who recognized it, the implications were staggering. For those who didn't, the tone in Admiral Valdez's voice made clear that this was significant. For those of you who do not know, Project Trident is our most advanced research and development directorate for command and control, intelligence systems, unconventional warfare, and signals intelligence. It exists to solve problems that conventional units cannot solve, to develop capabilities that do not yet exist, to operate in the spaces where technology and combat intersect in ways that most people cannot even imagine. She glanced down at something off-screen, then back up. Senior Chief Cross has more successful high-threat combat deployments than your entire platoon combined, Staff Sergeant. 47 separate missions across 12 years of service. Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Yemen, and a dozen other locations that remain classified and will remain classified for the next 25 years. Keller was staring at Elena now, really seeing her for the first time. The calluses on her hands, the way she sat, the absolute stillness that came from someone who'd learned to wait in hostile territory where movement meant death. The jamming signature you encountered during Oracle Fury was based on a hostile system that Senior Chief Cross personally located and dismantled under fire in the Bekaa Valley 2 years ago. The only reason anyone on this base knew how to defeat it is because she was the one who wrote the original threat analysis after that mission. She purchased that knowledge with blood and fire and combat experience that most operators never accumulate in entire careers. Admiral Valdez paused, letting that information settle. She was at Fort Bragg conducting a quiet, technical evaluation to assess this command's signal vulnerabilities. An evaluation that, thanks to your deplorable behavior, has been made profoundly and embarrassingly insightful. Colonel Harrison shifted in his seat. This was news to him as well. He'd known she was Trident. He hadn't known the evaluation was quiet, hadn't known she was essentially conducting a red team assessment of his base's capabilities. You did not see a paper pusher, Staff Sergeant Keller. You saw the one person on this continent who could save you from your own incompetence and the inadequacy of your supporting systems. And you tried to humiliate her. You tried to break her. You used institutional processes to sideline her. The Admiral's voice had dropped to something quieter but infinitely more dangerous. And when your inadequacy put you and your men in a simulated kill zone with no way out, she saved you anyway. Not because you deserved it, but because that is what professionals do. The silence that followed was the sound of careers ending and legends being born, of men realizing they'd stepped on something they couldn't see and had been shown mercy they didn't deserve. Colonel Harrison stood. The movement drew every eye in the room. He walked around the table until he stood directly in front of Elena's chair. Senior Chief Cross, on your feet. She stood, smoothly, efficiently, the same way she did everything. With a solemnity usually reserved for the most important ceremonies, Harrison reached out and carefully detached the fouled anchor insignia from her collar. The simple Chief Petty Officer anchor, the rank that Keller had dismissed as meaningless. Then Harrison reached into his pocket and produced a different insignia. It was the same fouled anchor, but mounted on top of it was a silver star. The rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer, E8, 2 full ranks above what Keller had thought she was. The promotion board results were expedited by Naval Special Warfare Command 6 months ago, Senior Chief. My apologies for the delay in its presentation. Administrative oversight on our part. He carefully pinned the new rank onto her collar. His movements were precise, respectful, taking care not to damage the fabric of her uniform. Then he did something that sealed the moment in the memory of everyone present. He took one step back, squared his shoulders, and rendered a slow, perfect salute to the enlisted woman before him. An Army colonel saluting a Navy senior chief was unusual enough to be noteworthy, but Harrison wasn't just going through motions. This was genuine respect, recognition of capability, acknowledgement that rank was just a number, and what mattered was what you could do when everything went to hell. Master Chief Callahan, his weathered face creased with pride, brought his own hand up in a crisp salute. His movements had the precision of 30 years of practice and the weight of genuine affection for the operator he'd helped train. Major Peterson stood and saluted. His face showed humility, gratitude, the expression of a man who'd been shown his own limitations and was grateful to have learned the lesson in training rather than combat. One by one, every other officer and senior NCO in the room turned toward Elena and rendered salutes. The cumulative effect was powerful, an institution acknowledging one of its own, paying respect where respect had been earned. Finally, at the back of the room, Marcus Keller slowly raised his hand to his brow. His salute was perfect in its execution, textbook, but his eyes were on the floor. His face was a mask of utter humiliation and dawning understanding. This was the first salute offered upward in shame and awe by a man who'd spent 3 days thinking he was superior to someone who operated at a level he couldn't even comprehend. It was the beginning of the correction. Elena returned each salute with the same precision. No triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, just professional courtesy. The acknowledgement of the institution's forms and functions. When the salutes were complete, Harrison spoke again. Additionally, Senior Chief Cross's technical assessment identified 47 critical vulnerabilities in our communications infrastructure. Had this been real combat against a sophisticated, near-peer adversary, enemy forces could have compromised our entire network. She's recommended $12.4 million in system upgrades and protocol changes. All recommendations have been approved at the division level and will be implemented beginning next quarter. He let that sink in. $12 million. That was the price tag on Fort Bragg's inadequacy. The cost of fixing problems they didn't even know existed until a small woman with a laptop and an extraordinary skill set had shown them the gaps in their armor. She didn't just save your platoon, Staff Sergeant. She potentially saved this entire base from catastrophic failure in future combat operations. The weight of that statement settled on Keller's shoulders like physical mass. He'd harassed someone who just identified and solved problems that could have gotten people killed. Real people, in real combat. Admiral Valdez spoke from the screen. The Article 15 proceedings will be conducted by your battalion command. The recommended punishment is 45 days restriction to base, formal letters of reprimand in your permanent files, and mandatory completion of professional military education focused on inter-service cooperation and appropriate conduct. Additionally, all 11 of you will prepare written apologies to be delivered to Senior Chief Cross. She paused. However, Colonel Harrison has recommended, and I concur, that your tactical performance during the exercise itself was exemplary. Once communications were restored, you completed your mission with precision and professionalism. That performance is the only reason we're not proceeding with more severe disciplinary action. Don't mistake leniency for weakness. Don't dishonor your Ranger scrolls further by failing to learn from this. Keller found his voice. It was rough, strained. Ma'am, we understand. We accept full responsibility for our actions. We were wrong, completely and totally wrong. It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said in days. The formal debrief continued for another hour. Technical discussions of the electronic warfare capabilities displayed, recommendations for training improvements, analysis of communication protocols and backup systems. But the real business was done. The correction had been administered. The lesson had been taught. When the meeting finally adjourned, people filed out in small groups. Officers heading back to their commands, NCOs returning to their units. The Rangers left together, a subdued group of men who'd learned something about assumptions and consequences. Keller lingered near the door. Elena was gathering her materials, preparing to leave, when he approached. Senior Chief. She looked up, met his eyes, waited. Ma'am, I'd like to request a moment of your time, if you're willing. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. They walked outside together. The November morning was crisp, the sky that particular shade of blue that North Carolina produced in late autumn. They moved away from the building, away from listening ears, until they stood in a space that felt private despite being on a military installation filled with thousands of people. Keller struggled to find words. Finally, he just spoke from the heart. "Senior Chief, I have no excuse for my behavior. None. I was arrogant and stupid, and I let my ego drive me to do something that was unforgivable." He paused, swallowed. "I saw the after-action report, the one from Bekaa Valley. I read about Lieutenant Morrison, about what happened there." Elena's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I lost half my squad in Kandahar 2 years ago. IED that I should have spotted. I was on point. It should have been me who died. But it wasn't. They did. And I've been carrying that guilt ever since." His voice was rough with emotion he'd kept bottled up. "I've been hiding behind the Ranger Scroll, using the aggression and the bravado to cover the fact that I feel like a fraud, that I survived when better men didn't. And I took that out on you because you were quiet, and I mistook that for weakness." He met her eyes fully now. "You showed me what real strength looks like. Silent, competent, humble. You saved us. You saved me, not because we deserved it, but because that's what professionals do." Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "Survivor's guilt doesn't give you permission to hurt others, Sergeant. Your men who died would be ashamed to see what you did to me in that dining facility." Keller flinched. The words hit harder than a physical blow. "But they'd be proud of how you led your squad under impossible conditions during the exercise, how you kept them together when everything went dark. That's the leader they would want you to be." She paused. "Your men look up to you. You have influence over them. Be worthy of that. Honor your fallen by being better, not louder. By lifting others up instead of tearing them down." Keller nodded. There were tears in his eyes now, and he didn't bother hiding them. "Thank you, Senior Chief, for the lesson and for saving us. I'll spend the rest of my career trying to be worthy of the second chance you gave me." He extended his hand, a peace offering, a request for forgiveness he knew he might not deserve. Elena looked at the offered hand, then she took it. Her grip was firm, final. "Make sure you do, Sergeant." They shook once, and then Keller walked away. His shoulders were straighter than they'd been in the conference room, like a weight had been lifted. Or maybe like he'd finally acknowledged the weight he'd been carrying and could now figure out how to bear it properly. Elena watched him go. Then she turned to find a young female soldier approaching tentatively. Private First Class Sarah Mitchell, 22 years old. She'd been working in the operations center during the exercise, had witnessed everything. "Senior Chief Cross?" Elena turned to her, waited. "Ma'am, I was in the dining facility that night. I saw what they did to you, and I've wanted to be in the military my whole life. But sometimes it's hard being a woman in this environment. The assumptions people make, the things they say." She paused, gathering courage. "Watching you this week, how you handled everything, what you accomplished, you showed me something I needed to see, that I don't have to be loud to be strong, that competence speaks for itself." Elena studied the young private, saw something of herself a decade ago, raw potential wrapped in uncertainty. "Then learn this, Private. Respect is earned through competence, not demanded through rank. Stay invisible until the moment you absolutely cannot be ignored. Then let your work speak louder than any words could." Sarah nodded, absorbing this like gospel. "Will I ever see you again, ma'am?" Elena's expression softened slightly, the closest thing to a smile. "Ghosts don't leave forwarding addresses, Private, but keep that fire. The military needs more women who refuse to be invisible when it matters." Sarah came to attention and rendered a perfect salute. Elena returned it with equal precision. Then the young private walked away, her bearing subtly different, straighter, more confident, carrying with her a lesson that would shape her career. That evening, Elena packed her gear in the Spartan quarters that had been her home for the past 2 weeks. The Pelican cases were loaded with methodical care, electronics wrapped and secured, classified materials encrypted and prepared for transport. Master Chief Callahan appeared at her door one final time. He leaned against the frame, watching her work with the expression of someone saying goodbye to a favorite student. They're rewriting the entire theater's electronic warfare doctrine based on your report, you know. Not just Fort Bragg, Third Army, SOCOM, the whole enterprise. Elena continued packing, but she was listening. Keller and his boys have their 45 days of restriction, but the cultural change is going to last a lot longer. 1st Ranger Battalion is implementing a complete overhaul of their inter-service cooperation training, using your case as the primary example. He paused. You shook the tree pretty hard, Elena. She picked up the small case containing the Phoenix patch, opened it, looked at the silver bird rising from embroidered flames, the motto beneath it, Fides in Tenebris. She had operated in darkness, had maintained faith when everything had gone wrong, had risen from the ashes of humiliation to demonstrate exactly what she was capable of. She closed the case, placed it carefully in her bag. Then she looked at Callahan. Her dark eyes held his with the same steady gaze that had so unnerved Marcus Keller. The vulnerability was identified, Master Chief. The process was validated. The system proved capable of correction when properly motivated. He understood. It had never been about revenge, never about proving herself to men whose opinions didn't matter. It had been about ensuring the system worked, that the institution she dedicated her life to protecting was sound, from the integrity of its networks to the integrity of its leaders. Where to next? Syria, high-value target, heavy electronic warfare environment. Threat assessment? The corner of her mouth quirked, not quite a smile. Impossible odds. Your specialty. My specialty. She closed the final latch on her gear. Everything packed, everything secure, ready to move to the next mission, the next impossible problem waiting for a quiet solution. As she passed Callahan, he put a hand gently on her shoulder. You taught them something they won't forget, Senior Chief. Every Ranger who graduates Fort Bragg from now on is going to learn your story, about respecting the quiet professionals, about never judging capability by appearance. She paused for just a fraction of a second. Her gaze went distant, already focused on the next horizon. She gave a small, final nod, the only acknowledgement she would ever need or offer. Correction was achieved. 6 months later, a Ranger training classroom at Fort Bragg hummed with the attention of 30 new graduates. They were fresh-faced, eager, still learning what it meant to wear the scroll they'd earned through blood and sweat in the crucible of selection. Staff Sergeant Marcus Keller stood at the front of the room. His bearing was different now. Still professional, still competent, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by something harder and more valuable. Humility born of lessons learned the hard way. On the screen behind him was a photograph, a woman in Navy uniform, her face obscured by shadow and distance, just enough visible to suggest her small stature and quiet bearing. This, Keller said, his voice clear and firm, is a reminder. The most dangerous operator in the room isn't always the loudest, isn't always the biggest, isn't always the one with the most visible credentials. He paused, making eye contact with students around the room. This operator saved my entire platoon during a training exercise when our systems failed and we were completely blind. She identified a threat that our multi-million-dollar electronic warfare suite couldn't detect. She neutralized it with a single shot from nearly 3 kilometers away. She did it quietly, professionally, and without any expectation of recognition. A young Ranger raised his hand. Sergeant, did you ever see her again after that? Keller shook his head. No, she deployed to Syria a week later. Classified mission. Came back to another classified mission after that. That's how these operators work. They appear. They solve impossible problems. They disappear. He advanced the slide. The new image showed the Phoenix patch, midnight blue, silver bird, Latin motto. She carried this patch, never wore it on her uniform. It's the unofficial emblem of Naval Special Warfare Development Group's Project Trident, one of the most classified units in the special operations community. He looked at the patch for a long moment. The motto is Fides in Tenebris, faith in darkness. It means operating when you can't see the outcome, maintaining discipline when everything's going wrong, having faith in your training and your team and your mission. He turned back to his students. I learned more from her in 1 week than I'd learned in the previous 5 years. I learned that respect isn't demanded, it's earned. That competence speaks louder than rank or tabs or scrolls. That the quiet professionals are often the most dangerous because they have nothing to prove to anyone. He advanced to the final slide. It showed just text. Real warriors don't announce themselves, they just are. Keller let that sit for a moment. Remember this lesson, carry it with you, and if you ever encounter someone who seems quiet or unassuming or easy to dismiss, remember that you might be looking at someone who operates at a level you can't even comprehend. Show respect, stay humble, and never, ever mistake silence for weakness. The class sat in absorbed silence, learning a lesson that couldn't be taught from a manual, only from lived experience and honest reflection. Somewhere over the Mediterranean, a C-130 transport aircraft cruised at 30,000 feet. In the cargo bay, among pallets of equipment and a small contingent of special operations personnel, sat Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Cross. She wore no name tape, no unit insignia, just the basic uniform and the rank on her collar. Her gear was packed in anonymous cases. Her presence was barely acknowledged by the other passengers who knew better than to ask questions about people who traveled on these flights. She had a tablet open, reviewing intelligence reports for the mission ahead. A target in northern Syria, high value, heavily protected, and surrounded by electronic warfare systems designed to make conventional approaches impossible. Her kind of problem. On her gear, barely visible, was the Phoenix patch, rising from flames, maintaining faith in darkness. She would arrive in country in 4 hours. The mission would launch in 6. She would operate in complete darkness, in hostile territory, against an enemy that didn't know she was coming. And when it was done, she would disappear again, back into the shadows, ready for the next impossible task. Because that's what ghosts did. They appeared when needed. They solved problems nobody else could solve. They taught lessons to those willing to learn. And then they vanished, leaving behind only stories and the hope that the lessons would be remembered. The aircraft droned on through the night sky, carrying operators to war, carrying ghosts to do the work that needed doing. In a classroom at Fort Bragg, young Rangers learned about the quiet professional who'd saved their predecessors. In motor pools and operations centers across the base, sergeants told the story of the woman who'd made fools of men, who thought rank mattered more than capability. The lesson spread, the culture shifted, and 30,000 feet above the Mediterranean, Elena Cross opened her eyes, checked her watch. 4 hours to insertion. She reached into her gear and touched the Phoenix patch one last time. Fides in Tenebris, faith in darkness, always.